And we had so much fun talking about voice last time. We will talk about voice again. And one of the things, so Mark and I always meet 10 minutes or so before the show and just catch up with each other so we don't have to do it live on air. But one of the things we were talking about was how much money people spend and how much time people spend on video. And how people are like worried about lighting and worried about what they look like and the quality of the camera. How come people don't care about voice as much?
It's funny because when you hear a voice, particularly if you don't have video along with it, it seems like it can have a huge impact on it can trigger memories, right? Hearing somebody's voice um, kind of takes you back to where you were when you first interacted with that person, or there was an important moment. I mean, it's funny because so many people now are doing, you do your Zoom with the camera on, or you're in an online class or whatever. People really don't do as many voice calls as they used to, where all you had access to was voice. So, yeah, we had a lot of interest last week or 2 weeks ago, Andy, on voice. And there are just so many issues there that we wanted to continue the conversation with everybody.
For some reason, I can't get. Why am I not getting? I don't seem to be able to post. Gosh. Yeah. So, sorry, I was distracted trying to run the tech behind the scenes. We need a third person.
All right.
So some of the questions we had last time that we wanted to cover today. One was filler words.
Yes.
When we get knocked off our game, filler words sneak back in. That's what just happened to me, right? And how can we overcome filler words? So maybe one of the things we can chat about just right now, like what are your strategies for helping people with filler words?
Yeah. The good news is that there is a really powerful substitute for filler words that still gives you the opportunity to kind of collect your thoughts while also having other advantages, and that is the pause. So that pause, instead of the or like, that pause has so many advantages over filler words. And Andy, you've talked a lot about pauses too, letting the other letting the listener or the audience actually absorb and think and maybe agree with you, like giving them space.
Give them space, and give your ideas space. Give your ideas space. Um, um, as we do this, if someone's there and you can pop a note in the chat, maybe about where you're from, or if you have a question, that'd be awesome because I'm not sure my chat's working. So
We
if you
apologize if we're
don't
not getting your
mind,
question.
help me out. It's really interesting with if you kind of do the psychology around filler words and public speaking. Most people, when they're speaking, think they need to fill all the space. So the filler words are actually just populating the space that pausing should happen. They're populating the empty space. So it's a lot of times it's almost a one-to-one trade out, where if you delete the filler word and just leave the pause. And what I've had some good luck with people training is, instead of thinking about not saying filler words, because as soon as I say don't think of a pink elephant, you're thinking about a pink elephant. As soon as I say, don't say a filler word, you're now thinking about filler words, and your brain does what you think about. So instead, think about pausing and
Yes.
just think about pausing. And as you do something, if you're about to say, just be like, the, the quiet is okay. The pause is okay. It's okay. And just kind of run that train track in your head of like, the pause is okay. The pause is my friend. And the
And
filler
it's
words start to kind of disappear.
right. And it's your audience's friend too, because you were saying just a minute ago, Andy, that you're you're populating like all of the space by putting these filler words in. You're crowding out audience opportunity for processing to an extent when there's such a better alternative. The other piece of this too with the ums and the likes is that I just actually finished a great interview with Jonah Berger. He's a professor at Wharton. He advises all the big brands, Nike, uh, Amazon, Google, all these major companies, and he's a real thought leader when it comes to communication and persuasion and language. And he has a new book that's coming out called Magic Words, and it's dropping Tuesday, the 7th. I think my smart speaker just responded to me when I said the A word. In any case, in his most recent book, Jonah talks about filler words. And I should just mention the interview is dropping on Friday, tomorrow, the 3rd of
And that's
March
on your
in the
that's
morning.
on your podcast.
Yes, on
Nice.
When Science Speaks. So if you go to
And where do
whensciencespeaks.com,
I find that?
you can find it on
We'll give it a
all your
little
favorite.
plug.
Sure, you can find it on all your favorite platforms, Apple, Google, and all of those, as well as going to whensciencespeaks.com. And if you sign up to be a friend of the show, you'll get this episode pushed to you every
Nice.
week. It drops on Friday. The reason I mention it though, it's just timely with this interview and what Andy and I are discussing right now, because what Jonah says in his book is that the ums and the likes introduce uncertainty in the listener's mind as to your message and your credibility. And so you're filling all these spaces. You're not giving the listener an opportunity to process or agree. And you're also degrading your authority to an extent with the listener when you're doing that. And when I think it's more, first of all, I'd say be patient with yourself, because as Andy was just saying, don't think about it. It's going to take a little while to get comfortable with it, and you'll start to actually put in pauses and give yourself sort of permission to do that, and it feels a lot better than the filler word also.
I love that you talk about credibility and trust and rigor and that sort of it's so important, right? Because as we introduce those uncertainties, like if you just think about basically if you translated that to English, it would be okay, let me pause for a second and think of what I'm going to say next because I'm not quite sure yet. Versus if you introduce a pause, if you just let it sit there, you say, okay, what I just said is so freaking important, it's going to take you a minute to understand it. And that's the exact opposite impact. So you're going from like undermining your own credibility to magnifying your own credibility when you trade out ums and ahs for pauses.
So true, and you're giving the audience a gift to an extent too,
You're giving
and
them
because
time,
yep, so they have time to think
right?
about what you said.
We're so familiar with our own work. It's our work. We're so familiar with it that it doesn't take any time for us to process it. And we forget that it takes our audience time to process because it's new. They may not even know the language we're using, let alone the actual phenomena we're studying, let alone the lab in which we're doing that work to study it. right? There's just layer upon layer upon layer of novelty, and people need time. People need processing time.
And
It's
what
very different. I think YouTube has kind of screwed us up here because so many people listen and watch YouTube on like 1.2, 1.4 speed.
guilty.
But if you think about what you're doing when you do that, you're you're basically skimming. And we don't want our audience to be skimming our talk. So
Right.
when you go really quickly, when you run at 1.2 speed because you're trying to make your deadline, because you're trying to jam too much into too little time, you're basically forcing your audience to skim because they can't process everything. And it's kind of random at that point what they actually process.
Andy, let's talk about some of the other elements of voice that we've been discussing because they are so important. I think the filler words is definitely a big deal. People obsess about it sometimes, or they're corrected many times, which of course doesn't help them get better at it. I would sort of think about it as a mindset, slow yourself down and give yourself the opportunity to, well, give your audience the opportunity first, right? And also give yourself the opportunity to kind of bolster your credibility or at least not degrade it with filler words. And it does take time and it won't always be perfect either. And that's fine too, that it's not 100% always dialed in.
You don't need to be filler word free. You just can't be filler word frequent.
I think that should be a t-shirt. Right, right.
um,
But there's the
so
other elements too that we want to get to, Andy. Why don't you start us off
so
related to
while
voice?
we're on the just while we're on the pausing for or the kind of cadence, I wanted to share a quick visual of this because I think we know we visuals help us kind of see what we're trying to get to. It's hard with voice because you can't see voice, right? Unless you study sound waves. But if you look at the visual here, what most people sound like presenting, see if we can actually click through this, is just this solid stream, right? We get this like paragraph of like bang, 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 and it's like just fast. And there's too much. So if you take that text and you highlight through some of the things that are most important, and I liken this to making it sound more conversational too, right? Conversation is less formal than written text. So if you look at this text that's highlighted, some of the formality is stripped down of it. Some of the sentences aren't even complete sentences. And then if you reformat it, and if you think about the page here as being like 4 minutes, I just stripped out 25% of the words. And now you can reformat it and you can speak in these smaller than sentence word groups. And you get pauses between them, but you get pauses between paragraphs, but then you get these micro pauses. I'm trying to kind of simulate it here on the page.
Mhm.
You obviously can't read it, but you can see it appear. You get these micro pauses within sentences. Stuff doesn't come out at all the same speed. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to encourage people to sound conversational
Because it's relatable and real.
versus sound like you're reading a book.
Yeah, it's much more relatable and authentic when you sound like that. And one of the other things I noticed, Andy, when I looked at the just the highlights, and that was a really cool way of displaying it, is there was some more content diversity, sentence diversity. So you had some fragments, you had some full sentences, some longer sentences, some really short sentences, all important when you're trying to retain interest in your listener. You're mixing things up, you're pausing, you're raising and lowering your voice. We talked a lot about that last time.
Right.
How to underscore importance by actually going softer and causing the lean in. And that really can help you emphasize your points. One other thing I just want to touch on briefly because we're talking about filler words. It has more to do with writing though, because this has reminded me when you showed the two versions, is that we have filler words in our writing also that we can eliminate. Words like that or the, and so just as you want to keep people's attention when you're talking, or maybe we'll do a separate segment on that with respect to writing, we also can make our writing a lot punchier and make it easier for
Right.
people to follow as well because we keep filler words in writing as well that are not necessary.
We delete out some of the. We just condense it. Get rid of it. Get rid of some of the repetition. Get rid of some of the qualification. When we're writing in the research space, we qualify things a lot, which is
Mhm.
good because we need to make sure we're not overclaiming. We need to make sure that. But what happens is what happens when we move into the presentation space is we can do that qualification with our voice. We can do that qualification with our body language. So the written word is no longer all that's available to us, right? And that's what we're talking about here is voice. So we can be tentative in a hypothesis or we can be certain in a hypothesis versus having to declare that with a lot of extraneous language.
Yeah, it's a vocal emoji, right?
Exactly.
Because I mean,
Yeah, it
emojis,
is.
you know, emojis were
That's why we invented
designed,
emojis.
right? They're
Emojis were
just
invented so we could have a conversation in writing.
yes, that's the whole purpose of emojis to provide that context. You see, that was really interesting on a page. Is it that was really interesting or ha, that was really interesting? Eye roll, eye roll.
Right.
We have no context. The emoji helps with that. And so what Andy's talking about now is incorporating that. We fortunately we have the ability to say, modulate, use body language when we're talking to convey that while using the same words.
Exactly. We just and
I just paused here.
this comes back a little bit to the conversation we were having last week of giving people permission to do it, right? So you don't you need to your science needs to be objective. Like your science needs to be rigorous. Your research needs to be rigorous. But when you're sharing your research, you don't need to be objective about the importance of the research and sharing the research. You need to show that you've done it rigorously, but it's okay for us to hear how you feel about it. In fact, I would argue if you don't let us hear how you feel about it, then why did I come listen to you talk? I should have
So
just
true.
stayed at home and read the journal article.
So true.
And that's most of that comes through voice. It's funny because the old statistic everybody cites, right, about the importance of body language and how body language is the dominant conveyor of information. It's like if that was really true, podcasts wouldn't exist. You
Right.
like if it wasn't voice, you wouldn't have voice only spaces. Most
Sure.
people who watch this video are probably doing something else and they're just listening to it. right? They're not watching us.
And you know what's funny? That just reminded me, and why this can be so vivid, while why your voice can convey such emotion, other than the intonation, you know, and all of those things, is because with only a voice, your listener is really forced to be thinking all the time about what you're saying and visualize for themselves what the content that you're talking about, what that means to them personally, how they relate to it based on their experience and their attitudes, their opinions, so forth. And many times you'll hear people say they'll meet someone and previously they had only heard them say on a podcast, or they'd only talked to them on the phone. This was back in the day, right? And they would, he looks nothing like I imagined. And, how many people have had that experience? The key, though, the point that I'm making is the operative part of that sentence is "as I'd imagined," because the person, your listener, with your
Imagine.
voice is imagining all the time. And that's what we want. We want them to be thinking along with us all the time, because if they're thinking about something else or just snoozing and not thinking at all, really, that's that doesn't encourage, that's not engagement. That's disengagement. You might as well stop talking.
When they're checking their phone and listening or doing so, they're not immersed. They're not immersed. They may catch some of what you said. Um, Marco, I just wanted to thank you. Appreciate the kind words. If there's something in particular you'd like us to hit on here, don't hesitate to give us a little cue in the comments there and push us in a direction. We have 7 or 8 minutes left. There's a couple of things that I want to make sure um, we do. One is talking about the importance of breath and how we sit and whether or not we're using our diaphragm. Breathing is so much of voice is breathing that if you haven't done any work on belly breathing or diaphragm breathing, whatever you want to call it, um, that's really important. As we get tense and closed, our air comes into our chest only, and we start only breathing in our chest. The depth and richness of our voice disappears.
Yes.
I don't know if you do. You have things you want to add about either breath or posture.
The one thing I do want to mention briefly is people don't like the sound of their own voice normally. And Andy and I talked about this in the previous session. I just want to underscore it because I feel like it can be a roadblock for so many people not developing their own voice. Sometimes you hear that comment as well, sort of how they're presenting the tone and how they're presenting information. You're just not used to hearing your own voice the same way that other people experience it. So if you're on a podcast or whatever it is, you're talking or you're giving a speech or giving a talk and it's recorded and you listen to it back or you watch it too, you're probably not going to like the way you sound. But that doesn't mean that you don't sound good. Right? It means that you sound different. Your sound is different than the sound that you're used to. And the sound that you're hearing now is the sound that people have always heard when they've heard you speak. And they're fine with it. Right. And so
Right?
sometimes
They're
you
they're fine with it.
yeah, they're fine with it. They're used to it. It's just
They're
you're
used
not
to it.
used to it. You're not used to it. It's like sometimes people say, "Oh, I'm delivering this presentation and I forgot to mention X, or I left out this couple of paragraphs." And oh, that's terrible. But guess what? You're the only one who knows that.
Right? They
Your
didn't have the
audience doesn't.
script.
Right. And so it's a different experience for them. So please don't let the sound of your voice, just to be foundational and fundamental here, please don't let the sound of your voice when you hear it deter you from developing your own voice and taking these suggestions and recommendations that Andy and I have given you to get out there and to really exercise your voice. Just because it sounds different to
Yeah.
you, it sounds the same. It's always sounded that way for your listeners.
Yeah, I think that's really important because listening to ourselves, once you get over, okay, I don't really like the way my voice sounds, once you get used to it, that hopefully no longer becomes true. But in the beginning, we've all had that reaction of like, oh, I don't really like the way I sound. It's because we sound differently when we hear ourselves in our head. Once you get over that, if you really listen to your voice, you'll find things that you do that you like, and you'll find things that you do that you don't like, and you can work on them, you can
Mhm.
change them, and that's really, that becomes really powerful when you start to be able to nurture some of the things that you like and do them more, and remove some of the things you don't like. So we talked about like uhs and ums, do those a bit less, and then do a bit more some of the things you like maybe you, when you get excited, you speak a little faster, or you lean into the mic,
Mhm.
or maybe when you say something important, you drop an octave and let it sit, and let people really hear it, and let it resonate. And those are things that over time you get better at.
Right. And you're developing your own voice, meaning your vocal style. And one other thing I want to mention along those same lines is you got to pause, of course, and you've got these other elements that Andy just mentioned. You also have repetition. I mean, you know the topic really well, of course. Your audience, you might make a really profound point, and if you don't pause after it, then it almost has the same value as a lot of other things you've said. Not everything you're going to say is going to have the same value or interest to your listeners or relate to your main point as closely, or maybe be your main point, right? And so, one other thing with your voice that you can do is after you make an important point, you can repeat it. You can also repeat it more slowly. You could repeat it by emphasizing different words, different operative words, sometimes they're referred to as, than the first one. So people can hear it differently. And it also allows you to both emphasize, and it could be another substitute for the if you find yourself about
Right,
ready
it fills
to
the space.
right
It fills the space you were trying to fill.
with purpose, though, that's really
Right.
what this whole thing is about. Is we don't we want to we our recommendation is not to try to fill all the space. When you do when you have a situation where you may feel like you're going to fill this pause or whatever it happens to be, just also have in your back pocket the thought, I'm going to repeat this again. I'm going to repeat it again. And that can let you also catch up with your thought process,
And it
which
lets your audience catch up.
right, right. It's filling the space with purpose, and an and an whatever. Those not only have they have no purpose. Period. Full stop. And they actually detract from the audience's perception of you to an extent.
I like how I like that idea of repetition not just being about, so repetition isn't just about letting them hear it again, it's also about letting them process it. Because it's hard to be quiet for 30 seconds. Like you say something, and you want to say, I want to give you a moment to think about that. Most people then keep talking. Most people say, let me give you a moment to think about that. Okay, now that you've thought about that, it's like, so instead, here's a strategy. Let me repeat that so you can think about it. Or let me repeat that while you think about it. And now you've built in the time and the direction for them to be thinking about what you want them to be thinking about, because you're saying it. All right,
Yeah,
we got a
more on Marco's
comment in
point.
from Marco that I want to make sure we get up here before we go. Point to something passionate science. I love that expression. Um, writing papers are scientifically still when presenting. We must show that. How do we scroll? Um,
Yeah, we must show that they are genuinely important and exciting for us and the audience. I truly believe in that and try to teach my students how important their professional passion is. I love that. That is so give energy, get engagement, right? You've got to give energy if you want engagement. No one's going to listen to a monotone person who doesn't seem passionate about their work. I can see how it can be challenging as an outsider, as a non-scientist, because you're probably one of the norms of the profession is dispassionate analysis and following the facts wherever they go and so forth. And now we're introducing something that might be a little different shade of that. I don't think it's inconsistent at all. I could see how maybe it could be viewed that way, but I think emphasizing the passion and the excitement and the in showing the energy is vital because you can't expect to get attention from an audience when you don't really seem like you're generating any energy.
nobody's nobody's gonna be more interested in what you're talking about than you are, which isn't really true. Like every once in a while, there's an outlier that's like, "Oh my god, this is." You're like, "Oh my god, you're even more interested than I am." But that's rare, right? So think about when you're the presenter, you're setting the bar, and everybody's going to be below you. Everybody's going to be inside you. So if you're setting the bar at just the facts, then then you've become a Wikipedia entry. And we didn't come to listen to Wikipedia. Like you become Chat GPT. And we all have that on our phone now. And that's we need to be more than that. We need to be
Right.
more than that if we want to be effective.
And I think we're talking about emotion, generally speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. Marco, I was so glad that you dropped in with us today, and that you really hit it there. That for me is the mic drop moment of the whole voice show. The last two sessions is let people hear your passion. Let people hear your commitment. Like if you don't want to call it passion, call it commitment, call it drive, call it whatever you want to call it, but call it something and let us hear it. Let her rip.
Right. And I don't think it's melodramatic to say that when you're doing that, when you're showing your passion, you're affecting the way people think and feel about that topic, which can then change behavior, right? And so when you show your science and you give people you peel back the curtain and you show that energy and excitement, that really is a step towards action and perhaps behavior change in a positive direction or support for discoveries that can make a huge
Right.
difference.
Hopefully, that's why we're doing it, right? Like we're 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 presenting because we want something to happen. We
Right.
want something to change. And
Wonderful. This has been yeah, no, I know we're right at time, Andy.
we're at time. We should wrap up. We will see everybody back in 2 weeks. We normally run on Tuesday, not Thursday.
We'll be back
So
on
we
next
will be
Tuesday.
back in 12 days. And keep an eye out. Usually the Friday before we get a note out about the topic. Please go follow our page, Sounds of Science Live. It's a LinkedIn page. So if you go and you follow that, we'll be able to stream. I think we have to get to 200 followers on the page before we're allowed to stream. So go hit the follow button on Sounds of Science Live. Help us get there. And Mark, it's been a pleasure again. And everyone, thanks for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody.
Thanks, Andy.